Hello, podcast fans, and welcome new listeners to another episode of Grassroots Radio.
When I look at the political landscape and the economic landscape of the world, I really have a difficult time accepting that this is what life should be.
We had so many concerns about education, technology, agriculture, Barbuda, health, the environment. You will be so surprised as to what they are engaged in.
If we can do that, we can walk on that path, we will find a lot of solutions, we'll find a lot of adventures, we'll find a lot of answers.
All this and more, right here on Grassroots Radio.
I'm your host, Unique Bird, back from a little personal hiatus. This week, speaking with 22-year-old Kieran Murdoch, who is no stranger to the airwaves. Kieran has been a reporter with the former Observer Media Group, now Newsco, where he was also a news and program producer and sometimes even a program host. We talk a lot of politics in this interview, and it runs a bit to the negative end of the spectrum, which isn't normally what the show is about. However, my team and I felt it was important to get this particular perspective out there because, in all honesty, this is how a lot of people perceive the political situation in our country at present, and it's a reality that we cannot afford to look away from or ignore. That said, I'm hoping that you guys will learn something from this podcast. I know I definitely did, and I'm looking forward to hearing the discussions in our WhatsApp group. If you're not already a member of the new Grassroots WhatsApp group, Grassroots Connection, and you would like to be included, please send us a direct message on whatever social media platform you are comfortable using. We are on Facebook, on Instagram, and on Twitter. Our handle on all three platforms is GrassrootsANU. Tell us a bit about yourself and why you would like to join the group, and we will take it from there. And now we're going to take the interview from here. Ladies and gentlemen, Kieran Murdoch.
All right, my name is Kieran Murdoch. I am 22 years old. I'll actually be 23 towards the end of the year. I'm an Antiguan and Barbuda, and I've lived here for most of my life. And in terms of my work, I've been a reporter for all of my professional life. I started working when I left the Antigua State College. That would have been in 2015, if I'm remembering correctly. Hopefully I am, but that would have been in 2015. At that point in time, I was not sure exactly what I should study, or what I should have studied, rather, if I had gone to university at the time. So I went job seeking. The Observer Radio and newspaper was familiar to me because I had been in and out of their studio a few times for a program they used to have on Fridays called Youth Connect. They still have it, and they now call it Youthology. But at that time, I was exposed to media and radio, having had the opportunity to been a guest or been a panel part of the team of young people that would speak on that program in those years. And so when I went job seeking, I just thought, it would have been a sensible, or you could even call it an easy idea, to have made an application there. And once I started there, I sort of fell into the various roles that I would have found between the radio and the newspaper quite easily, I should say. I say easily, but this is not to say that, of course, for the first few months of the job, it wasn't extreme teething. Mm-hmm. But eventually I got accustomed to it, and I developed an appreciation for the actual practice of reporting and of dealing in media.
And you mentioned just now that you've lived in Antigua and Barbuda for most of your life. Where else have you lived besides Antigua?
Perhaps I shouldn't have said that. Perhaps I shouldn't have said most. Probably was just in my way of speaking. But I've lived there for all of my life. I haven't done all that much traveling. I've been to places in the Caribbean. I've been to Canada and the US. I've been to one or two countries in Europe, which was just that was a specific trip that I was able to do when I was in third form as a member of a scout troop. But I've been outside with vacation, church trip, and that sort of thing. But I've lived there for all of my life.
Now you are studying at the University of the West Indies, so I guess now you are actually kind of living outside of Antigua in Trinidad. What made you decide to go to university at this point in your career, and what are you studying and why?
Well, I made the decision to go to university honestly because it's something I had put off for going on 3 years. And I began to worry that, if I didn't go, I would never go, to be honest. Mm-hmm. What I'm studying now is not necessarily something that I had any sort of concrete plan as to what it would enable me to do in the future in terms of an income. But I chose to study politics and international relations. And I'm actually hoping to switch that to politics and economics because I suppose this is what happens at university, but you're introduced to various things and you develop different liking. So I was introduced to one or two introductory courses in economics in my first year. And that has encouraged me, now that I'm going back for my second year, to see if I could possibly make that part of my focus. But yeah, in the first place, I would have started in August, should I say September really, of 2018, and I would have done so. I suppose I was kind of getting tired of the daily grind of work. And I wanted to go to university to see what it was about. I wanted to gain the experience. And it had just, enough time had passed to me. There was enough of a gap that I sort of said, I am willing to take this course of study. And that course of study specifically I chose because of my experience in reporting with the radio, with the newspaper, where I was exposed to a lot of government and a lot of politics, which sort of helped develop an interest in me for understanding the way in which government should work, as opposed to the way it does work.
That was going to be one of my questions, was whether your experience in the media had an effect on you deciding to go deeper into politics. And so what are some of the things that you're already pointing to about how the government works in Antigua versus how you think it should actually work? Can you give some examples of that?
I suppose that's an expansive discussion to be had. Speaking from the perspective of someone who has been a reporter, you could immediately hone in on the aspect of transparency, the aspect of accountability, and how government reports its activity to the public, in how it presents information, in how willingly it makes information about its decisions, its spending, and its failures, really. And that's actually the most critical part. How readily it makes that information available to the public to enable the public within the broader framework of an organic democracy to actually criticize the government, to actually put pressure on the government to remedy things that it is doing which are not optimal, which are not delivering the best results, or which are downright wrong. In Antigua and Barbuda, I don't think anybody can deny that we don't do that to the extent that we should. I'm not even sure that we do that to any extent at all, in terms of that transparency which I discussed. And so that's something that I would have noticed off the bat, working for the newspaper, working for the radio. And it's something that would have developed my interest in just sort of studying politics in general. From my experience, it is like pulling teeth to get certain information from the government. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about a department, a minister, a statutory corporation. Many times, the information that you will readily get is information that is not derogatory. However, the very test of a transparent organization is the fact that you are, in fact, able to get information that could potentially be derogatory. It's there for you to see so that you can actually look at it and you can say, well, you don't appear to be doing very well here. You appear to be spending money wildly in this area, not delivering results, and we would like to see better. In fact, in terms of reporting in general, we don't necessarily have a culture within our government, within our society that demands, and it's broader than government. I mean, because in my experience with the newspaper and the radio has shown me that it's a similar situation in private organizations. It could be companies, it could be NGOs, it could be church groups. there is a general absence of that culture of accountability, of reporting, of transparency, in that individuals must be accountable for what they do. They must be accountable for what they spend. They are responsible to report back on what they spend and the results of having spent that money. They're required to spend it transparently. They are accountable to the rules that govern the office which they hold, which is something that is extremely critical, especially when it comes to government, because you will often find in situations in government that persons are acting beyond the scope of their authority, but the culture is not such that their subordinates, their superiors, people around them, and the society at large stops and says, what you are doing is beyond the remit of your authority. So, I mean, yeah, as an example, just from the experience of reporting, you could take that.
Mm-hmm. And this is something that you've, of course, experienced firsthand, being a reporter and having to go out and kind of find this information and just, I'm going to paraphrase what you said and call it a culture of secrecy. Because that's kind of the opposite of being transparent when you have a responsibility to be transparent. There's all these roadblocks in the way. And even though we have laws about freedom of information and freedom of the press, they seem to not be enacted. Like they're on the books, but in real life, it doesn't really function that way.
Yeah, that is most definitely the case. I mean, we have a Freedom of Information Act on the books, which is something that I would have had to have made reference to a number of times in my experience reporting. We also have a Prevention of Corruption Act, which, to be honest with you, in my opinion, is not worth the paper it's written on. And neither is the Freedom of Information Act, really. Neither of them are stringently enforced. And even if you go into those two pieces of legislation, I mean, I haven't been into them in quite some time, but I did have the necessity to go into them, different parts of them, for different stories, for different things that I would have followed up over the last 3-4 years for news purposes. And, you know, you generally get the sense that regardless of which administration you're dealing with, whether you're dealing with the current administration, the previous administration before that, there really is no serious sense. There's no serious approach. There's no serious mood towards the issue of transparency, integrity, and corruption. And so you go into the Freedom of Information Act, you find that it has stipulated certain things. It talks about a commission. It talks about certain rights. It talks about certain requests. But in practice, the Freedom of Information Act, for example, is not something in my experience that the government at any stage has made any great effort to sensitize government workers about, to sensitize its public service, all the various branches of its public service that work in various departments and statutory corporations. The idea that we have as a state a Freedom of Information Act, and therefore we want to develop a freedom of information culture. Mm-hmm. And you as public servants will be expected, falling in line with this freedom of information culture, to make information readily available, to not have that culture of secrecy, as you use that phrase, mm-hmm. And to be ready to, even when it is derogatory information, which is often the information that you can never get, mm-hmm. To make it available, to make it public, because that is the nature of how the state should run. And so you don't find that. I mean, even you talk about the Prevention of Corruption Act. I mean, it is one of the most comical cases that I think I've ever encountered, is that we have a Prevention of Corruption Act, and we also have a Integrity in Public Life Act, for example, mm-hmm. Which between them create an Integrity Commission, and to the layman's reading, give that Integrity Commission the independence to investigate allegations of corruption once it is satisfied that there are grounds to do so. You have in its current composition the Integrity Commission as it is now, being staffed with individuals who have put forward the public view or the public position that from their interpretation and reading of the legislation, they do not have such independent power. They are not empowered by the legislation, according to them, to independently investigate something once it comes to their attention. So, for instance,
so why are they there?
That is a fantastic question. But one story, for instance, the Associated Press. The Associated Press ran a story about I don't remember the man's name, but he is somebody involved in opera in New York. And the story, I believe, ran between yesterday and the day before. And the story from the Associated Press was it was an investigative one, but they had gathered the accusations of a number of women who had accused this man of sexual harassment over his career. And they published this story. And then I noticed another story where the opera or the company that manages, or perhaps I don't know if it was like the broader organ that oversees that aspect of the arts industry in New York. But there was a response which said this will be investigated based on the story that was published. That's just an example. You would not have something like that in Antigua and Barbuda as it relates to a government authority or the Integrity Commission. So, for instance, you could publish in any newspaper. Let's say we had a newspaper called The Guardian. You could publish on the front page of The Guardian that Kieran Murdoch, who is a minister of government, has been accused of stealing $50 million from the Treasury. And within the story, what you will see, let's say they provide evidence, they provide receipts, they provide testimony from people at banks saying that, yes, he took this money, it's here, it's still here. We even have recordings of him discussing his corrupt activity. The Integrity Commission's position is that in the face of that, it can and would do nothing. It must wait on a member of the public to bring a complaint, to take note of that evidence and bring it to the Integrity Commission in the form of a complaint, and only then would it be able to act. And I must tell you that in the history of this current Integrity Commission, they have not acted feverishly on the complaints which I am aware that they have received. They are complaints which they have received, which they have, I know of one complaint they received, which they acted on initially, and then it came to a great pause. And there was another complaint which they had received, which they sort of rejected, saying it was not served properly. So that's the sort of situation that you will run into in terms of that goes beyond a lack of accountability and transparency. That's sort of just blatantly not doing your job.
Right. Okay. If we take a wider view of that problem and potentially why it could be occurring, one of the things I notice in Antigua is that a lot of these positions, like on these commissions, are filled by appointment from political persons. So if the whole reason that you have this position in the first place is because of your existing relationship, professional or personal, with someone in a position of power, then even though your job is to kind of keep that power in check, you have this conflict of interest, is basically what it is, that because you're in this position now, you're going to use it to protect the person who helped you to get to that position because you want to maintain your power. So do you think that there is a need for us to select these commissions in a different way that doesn't bias them so much in one direction or another?
I would agree with that, and I would also go further to say that Antigua and Barbuda, from my thinking just over the last couple of years, is desperately in need of a number of constitutional amendments, perhaps even a broad constitutional reform, and also reforms in terms of corporate governance and the way that, as you say, appointments, management, and things like that are done. We have, for all of our existence politically, we have maintained a system where one party, regardless of which party that is in government, tends to have a level of absolute or total control over the machinery of government. Now, it is debatable to what extent this is necessary when it comes to getting the government business done, enacting policy, and also, just carrying out a change of affairs, because that is what people tend to elect governments for. When you elect the same administration back into power, you may be satisfied that things are going well. If you elect a new administration, arguably the basis on which a population would elect a new administration is because they want radical change. They want things to change. And so you'd want to have governments that have the power to affect change. You wouldn't want to isolate government so much from various different things, whether it be the police, whether it be anti-corruption bodies, whether it be the public service. You wouldn't want to isolate it so much that coming into office in a situation where all those mentioned things require serious change, that a government's hands are tied and it says, well, these are bodies that are just totally independent. They're totally isolated from us. Our policies really can't affect them. And so whatever problems they are experiencing are not things which we can actively address. You don't want to have that situation. But what we have is the other extreme, where, and I say the other extreme, but the other extreme, it doesn't necessarily manifest itself in law so much as it does in practice. It often does manifest itself in law. But anyway, we have the other extreme where, as I said, it's the nature of total control. We seem to have a political system where we allow whichever ruling administration and the leader of that administration, which in our case would be the prime minister, to make appointments to staff offices, sort of carte blanche, and in too many instances. So, for instance, let's go to the Constitution, for example, and this is just my personal opinion. I know some people disagree with me, but if you go to the Constitution, I mean, we have provisions in our Constitution that stipulate that the prime minister can veto, basically, the individual who would be nominated as the Commissioner of Police. Now, we can't select the Commissioner of Police, but the Constitution provides that if the Police Service Commission, and by the way, the Police Service Commission would be individuals who are all appointed by the Prime Minister anyway. So, I mean, you can imagine,
The tentacles are long,
Yes, yeah. So, I mean, you have that. And then you have the provision that a sitting prime minister can veto the nomination of a police commissioner. So, for instance, if the commission comes and says, that Joe Bob is the best person, we want him to be the commissioner of police. The prime minister has the power to say, well, no, Joe Bob is not the guy. Bring me somebody else. I can't tell you who it is, but Joe Bob, no, I won't tolerate Joe Bob. We also have provisions where I think that applies to both the commissioner and the deputy commissioner. We also have provisions for senior ranks, such as assistant commissioner. The prime minister must be consulted about those senior ranks. Now, one could argue that these are necessary stipulations, because again, you could come back to that argument where you say, well, look, a government has been elected into office. It must have the power to effect change within the law enforcement system. And it cannot affect that change if it is unable to indicate in some small way, in some partial way, its preference for the best persons to lead that law enforcement system. So how can I, as the leader of the country, expect great reform within the police, if that's what I'm promising, if I have absolutely no control whatsoever over who the hierarchy of the police force is? Now, one could make that argument. But what you also have coming into that mix in Antigua and Barbuda, as you do in frankly all Caribbean countries, is a very tribal politics, where it is the nature, and this now goes from what the law does to what the individual does, it is the nature of individuals in political positions and individuals with political power to appoint persons loyal to them, to appoint their friends, to appoint their supporters, to high office, into various positions, to support them and to carry out their policy. And in many instances, these persons are either biased in their favor, these persons sometimes lack integrity, these persons are sometimes totally unqualified, and that has sort of become the norm. So, I mean, you mentioned things like commissions. I mean, we have developed, and boards, we have developed a culture, and it's not just here, of course, it's throughout the Caribbean, but we have developed a culture, and it has been the culture for decades, where there's a whole host of positions on statutory cooperation boards, in the Senate, and various independent offices, or I shouldn't say independent, but various individual offices, if you'd call them that. They're sort of created by legislation to do specific tasks, and they're not so much under the complete direction and control of a ministry, offices like that, which just serve as rewards, really. I mean, you get in, let's say that you have just become prime minister. You hand them out to your various supporters, your friends, and so on. We do the same thing with diplomatic positions as well. So you have this pool. So you have the Senate, you have the boards of statutory corporations, you have these special offices, commissioners, and you have diplomatic appointments. That really and truly, some of them go to individuals who are totally deserving, individuals who are totally competent and totally qualified. And then others go to individuals who are the complete opposite. And the functioning of government suffers as a result.
Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned the diplomatic appointments, and I know there's been a lot of controversy in the last few years about us having, Antigua and Barbuda having diplomats who are not Antiguan. Nobody's ever heard of them, but they have our passports. They've been appointed as special economic envoys, things of that nature, and then they're traveling overseas and getting into trouble to the point where allegedly we now have to have all our passports recalled and everyone needs to get new ones because the ones that exist now are like sketchy, and there isn't a lot of information about what's happening with that, why it is, but it's now become an expense for everyone with an Antiguan passport. So yeah, I guess being someone in the media, what role do you think, or what responsibilities do you think the media and journalistic fraternity have in terms of highlighting these issues and, I don't want to use the word foment, but to encourage the public to take a closer look at what's happening in terms of governance of the country and to start to apply some of this pressure to bring about changes? Yeah.
I would say that the role of the media in that regard is critical. And the reason I'd say it's critical is because you really don't have a self-check mechanism that operates properly within our government. There are a number of self-check mechanisms that should operate in any government without the need for an external entity that audits, checks, reviews what the government does.
Do you think that we ever had those in place in our government and that they were removed, or is it a situation where they were never in place?
No, they are in place in law. They just are not in place in practice. Okay, for instance, one of the greatest self-check mechanisms that any government has in a Westminster system is an opposition. And let's be frank, Antigua don't have no opposition. Antigua's opposition is a joke. So
yes.
Both in terms of its parliamentary activity and in terms of the actual parties that currently comprise opposition to the government, what are we talking about? We're talking about a group of individuals who are not doing exactly what it is they should be doing and have not, over the last however many years that I have been paying attention to affairs because I've been reporting from the radio and from the newspaper, have not done a particularly good job of reviewing and auditing the government. I mean, we have a leader of the opposition presently. And I don't mean to be harsh, but I think sometimes we have to be harsh because nobody wants to be harsh. Mm-hmm. We have a leader of the opposition presently. He really should not be leader of the opposition. His abilities publicly have not satisfied what any citizen of the country should desire as a leader of the opposition. I mean, his maiden speech in Parliament was 5 minutes. It was all of 5 minutes. And again, I say that I'm honestly trying not to be harsh, but I find that, it's something that we avoid saying. When you have individuals in places who, for whatever reason, are clearly not the best to be in those positions, and everybody taking a solid dance around it and they tiptoe and
yeah, and honestly, not only just not the best, but not functioning at all. I mean, you could not be the best for something and still be trying. But I see really a lack of function.
Yeah, so you have. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was saying. So you have a leader of the opposition, for example. One of the things that comes up from time to time in discussions that you have on radio is institutions like a public accounts committee. You have a public accounts committee which should function, which is historically a committee of parliament, and this is coming out of the history of the British Parliament and other parliaments that have followed that tradition. A public accounts committee, which is a permanent committee of parliament, which reviews the government's accounts, basically audits the government, and is traditionally led by the leader of the opposition. And we have fallen into a culture of successive administrations ignoring the role of the Public Accounts Committee. Now, my argument is, and this is, again, regardless of which, I should say, administration is in power. My argument is that, if you are the opposition and you are running into a roadblock from the government in order to put together the Public Accounts Committee, well, you have to scream that from the mountaintop from the day that you get into office until the day that you leave.
Right.
You have to make that clear. You can't just lie back and say, well, it's such a difficult thing to do because, perhaps the current administration doesn't make it easy for us to do, so whatever. You don't get paid to do that. You get paid to, as I said, scream it from a mountaintop from the day that you get into office until the day that you leave. And if you're not doing that, well, then you're not doing your job.
Mm-hmm. Very true. And I guess one of the reasons often cited why there is this lack of functional opposition is that when it all comes down to it, the politicians, regardless of what side of the aisle they sit on, are at the end of the day friends, boon companions, well met. And so there is a reluctance to rock the boat, as it were, because that could then cause issues for them in other areas.
I find that's very true. But I would also put in to say, or I would pull back on that a little bit to say, as much as it is true that you do have a sort of a one fraternity, if you will, amongst politicians, whether they're cut from the same cloth, whether they come from the same union, whether they got into politics together before they split into different parties, and they all know each other and they all associate with each other. And in the background business dealings of Antigua and Barbuda, they do business with each other in their commercial capacities. And so at the end of the day, even though they have a public political persona which is against each other in private, it's a different situation. Not to say it's always the case that they are chummy friends from different parties, but it just is not the sort of antagonism that genuine a rivalry that is, of course, presented to the public. That is true to an extent. But what I also find is that more so than that is the fact that the political culture is such that we have become numb. We have become, we have become fused into this way of thinking that suggests that it is what it is, and there's no point in attempting to change it. People get tired. Even the opposition gets tired. And that doesn't matter which opposition it is between which administration. If you are in a situation where something is what it is, and every time you attempt to challenge it, you run into a problem, and perhaps you're victimized and you find consequences. After a while, it begins to weigh you down, and you just decide that, this is just the way things function. So you find that there are so many things that go wrong that we no longer even recognize as things going wrong because it's just the way things.
It's just function. Normal.
So it sort of goes beyond the possibility that individuals on opposing sides of the aisle may actually have good relations, and it sort of goes into the fact that individuals on opposing sides of the aisle they have never been able to get anywhere in keeping each other in check, and they've just accepted that, and so now it's just not even a thought.
Mm-hmm. It's just I'm going to do what I can get away with when it's my turn, and then when it's your turn, I'll let you have the same courtesy, I guess.
Yeah, I'd like to say that that's a bit morbid, but it's the truth.
Oh man, it's such a complicated thing, right? And you mentioned the tribalism, like the tribal kind of politics, and the fact that people are kind of divided into these camps. And so it's a matter of, it's more like a sporting event, right? Elections are kind of just an opportunity for you to cheer for your team and help them get into the position of power. And after that, we just kind of turn our attentions to distractions and entertainment until it's the next time to cheer for your team.
Yeah. What I have actually realized, I think it goes deeper than that. What I've realized is that, yes, there is tribalism, but as much as I had initially found it quite easy and simple to blame if you want, each of us individually as average citizens, in terms of how we interact with our politicians and in terms of the standards of accountability that we hold them to. But having had the opportunity to interact further with the general public for news purposes and on political questions, I have come to realize that people genuinely cannot be expected to do that which is not in their best interest. And so what I have discovered is that really and truly, a lot of the tribalism is not as condemnable as it would seem to be. On the level of those who are doing well economically, yes, you could probably condemn it. But on the level of those who genuinely struggle, and that, of course, in Antigua and Barbuda is a broad cross-section of people, for them, they genuinely subsist and benefit with that tribal politics as a part of the way they live. So you will find individuals who they have a government position because of that tribal politics. They have a job because of that tribal politics. There's income. There's bread on their table because of that politics. And whereas from the outside, we see politicians give out, especially around election time, cash and gifts and so on. They often are giving them out to individuals who genuinely need these things and genuinely appreciate these things. And whereas somebody may, stand from outside and say, well, what's going on here is trivial. What's going on here is the persons who should be rejecting these things, and you'd want to say that. You'd want to say that very easily and without complication. That they should reject these gifts. They should reject the partisanship, the tribalism. But it has become such a deep part of the way that we operate and the way that we live that I realize that it would be a very difficult task to expect people to do otherwise. I'm not trying to excuse their behavior. I'm just trying to say that
it's a reality.
Condemning it is for me is not as easy as it used to be, because you see people who are they genuinely need, and this way of living where my party is in power and I am able to get first preference in terms of whether it's housing, first preference in terms of utilities forgiveness, first preference in terms of this, that, or the other. I'm able to get first preference in terms of back pay being given to me from the Treasury. I'm able to get some manner of government work. I'm able to get this favor or that favor from my MP, and it becomes a legitimate part of the way they live. Such that, of course, you have areas of the country where you have a particular member of parliament, and you could look at photographs of that area of the country from 40 years ago, and you could look at photographs of that area of the country today, and you could say, well, my God, nothing much has changed. What has this individual been doing for the last 40 years? And you'd think that on that basis, that individual should have been carted out of that constituency a long time ago by voters. But if you go to each and every single one of those members of the constituency, that MP knows their names, he knows their families, he has secured jobs for a great many of them, he has acted like a bank, he has become an institution unto himself and unto that area, such that, to expect individuals without being appreciative of that culture, and it's a negative culture, but to expect individuals to do better simply on the basis of a very dry and broad view of this is right, that is wrong, it's not something I'm able to do anymore.
Yeah, I really appreciate you saying that, because the other thing about the condemnation is that it doesn't change anyone's mind. But now that we have, some younger people coming into politics, and we have a new generation of Antiguans and Barbudans who are a lot more aware. They've traveled outside of Antigua, they've lived abroad, they've studied abroad, and they have a different view of how things can and should be done. Do you see any places where that old mindset is starting to shift and change?
To be frank and honest with you, absolutely not. And I know that sounds terrifyingly morbid, but it's the truth. I personally find that individuals, especially young individuals, and it's been happening over generations, Each new generation has the tendency to think or to say that we have a young generation which is going to do better, is going to think differently, and is going to make things better. At some point, the current generation of politicians, which we have now, were that generation. What I see in my experience is either one of two things happening. And that is when you have young people, particularly, who recognize that there is a better way to manage national affairs. There are positive changes that need to take place politically in their country, economically in their country, socially in their country, and they don't see it happening. They're just going to move. And that has been, that's just been the reality. Whether they're going to move to another Caribbean country, whether they're going to move to Canada, whether they're going to move to the United States, or whether in this day and age, they're going to take the opportunity to move to all the other different places that are much more open now for Caribbean people to move to. China, places in Europe, even places in Africa, even places in the Middle East, Australia. They're just going to leave. And I think that's one of the saddest things about the fact that when you have a country which is developing, it's classified as a developing country, and it's thought of as a quote unquote third world country. And you have within the leadership of that country, through successive administrations, the inability to realize that the way in which we carry out national affairs and our inability to use the prime opportunity which we are given, which is leadership of the nation and lawmaking powers of the nation, our inability to use that opportunity to make the social, political, and economic conditions better is driving intelligent young people away from the country. They go overseas, they are amazed at what they see overseas in terms of just how society functions. And it's not necessarily specifically about government, just socially, a greater deal of intelligent, progressive thinking among members of the society on social issues, on political issues, and economic prosperity. They don't necessarily feel inclined to come back to a nation where A, they don't have that, and B, attempting to get there becomes so difficult because they are aware of the obstacles to that. So you either have individuals who will leave, or B, you have individuals who will be in the country, and being that the economic, social, and political situation in the country is not ideal, you have individuals who will say, well, look, I'm just going to toss in my hand with whichever faction seems to be the best at the time, which is, again, what a lot of bright young people do. And in so doing, they themselves then become the next generation of leaders who perpetuate the exact same behavior. And the country gets nowhere. I admit it's very, very morbid, but I tell you the honest truth. Those are the only two things I see happening. Either A, you get fed up with it and leave, and we all have enough relatives and friends and cousins and family that we can point to as examples of that, if not ourselves.
I'm B, one of those people.
Exactly. Or B, you are present in the country, you desire a much higher standard of living, and the shortcut which is presented to you of membership in a partisan clan or a partisan group which shares certain benefits amongst themselves unfairly, as opposed to directing their energies to the general advancement of the population at large. You say to yourself, well, look, I'm a young person. I've grown up in a certain social condition. I don't wish, and this is a totally fair desire, I don't wish and I don't have any desire to maintain that level at which I grew up. I want to advance. I want to advance socially. I want to advance economically. I want to have some money. I want to have some property. I want to do well in life. I don't want to struggle. And if it is that joining this clan or this group is the best way to do that so that I can experience these unfair benefits, and if it is that I have to sacrifice some of the morals or the principles which I had in order to do so, I will do it. And the reason that I'm so willing to do that is because other legitimate avenues have not been presented to me, or have not been made as attractive to me simply as a citizen of the country, that I know to myself that economic opportunities have been created for me that I could take advantage of, that I don't actually need to join this political clan.
Was about to be a politician too. Maybe then I could have make any decision, look. Maybe then I make 100 million disappear. Then me act like me no care what you bought me back in there. because the sad reality.
But I've spoken a lot of politics throughout this entire interview, but I suppose that's just what my mind revolves around these days.
Mm-hmm. I guess I'm a bit curious about your family background, because I think that also has a lot to do with how you end up going in life. So is your family a prominent family on the island? Are they more, your average Antiguan family? Tell me about that.
My father is a permanent secretary. Well, I should say now he is an advisor in the Prime Minister's office. For most of his professional career, however, he was a permanent secretary in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and functioned as well in an ambassadorial capacity. So, yes, you cannot deny that being the son of somebody who was in government has largely affected my sort of professional orientation and interest in affairs of government. My mother is an attorney. And again, government and law coming together would have sort of oriented me towards an interest in the affairs of the state and how they function. So if you were to point to an influence for me, even having been at the radio and at the newspaper, at Observer Radio and the Daily Observer, and my interest while I was there in covering political stories and covering stories that had to do with the executive, had to do with parliament, had to do with statutory corporations, had to do with partisan politics and things like that. That interest would have been sparked by, of course, the background of my parents and their professional work.
Okay, let's talk about some of the highlights of your time as a reporter. What were some of the most interesting stories, let's say, that you worked on while you were at Observer?
If I had to name two highlights in terms of just events that I had to cover, several stories might have come out of them, but just events would have been our last election in March of 2018, as well as going to Barbuda to look at the damage and the effect of Hurricane Irma. The last election that we just had was an interesting experience. There were many people at Observer. Most of the people at Observer were there long before me, and so they've covered several elections. That was my first election, of course, covering it, right. But it was also my first election just being aware of an election. I mean, of course, I would have been alive for several other elections. I just really would not have been paying attention to what was going on.
Okay.
But the last election in March of 2018 was an interesting and an enlightening experience in terms of seeing political mobilization, seeing the campaign machinery of politics going into play, seeing the sort of statistical analysis that tends to come in because that parties bring in various posters to do things. Sort of gauging the opinions, the desires, the needs, and the requirements of the public, as opposed to what their political parties are offering. You also sort of get an opportunity to train your own perception and analysis, because you might look at things before the result, and you may think, well, just from the feel of things, I think that this may be the likely outcome, and that it may differ slightly, it may differ greatly, and you may say to yourself, well, here's a lesson for me to say that it's not always as it looks, and of course, for future elections, one would have that knowledge, that ability to say, well, simply because people are saying this, or these people feel like this, or whatever, is not really an indication of who's going to win, what success is going to happen there.
So do you find that being a part of that whole scene and observing the election, do you think that it's given you a much higher critical faculty of discerning, what is good information, what's misinformation, what should be paid attention to, and what shouldn't be?
I would say so. I mean, it was a short election. It was only it was 3 weeks from the announcement of the date of elections to the actual elections, because the sitting prime minister at the time gave the minimum notice that he's allowed to give under the Constitution. Again, which is something you should probably not you, but we should consider nationally as an issue for reform. But anyway, it was a short election. I was more so sort of interested in the sort of activity and the sort of energy that went into it. I mean, when you saw the things that people are willing to say on the platform, the gifts that people are willing to give out, the feedback from members of the public, mixed feedback about how they feel about progress, how they feel they're being treated. I don't know. It's such an enlightening experience to get it all at once in that giant mesh. I mean, and to see the way in which political parties function. I mean, for instance, I tell people that on the night of the election, after the result was declared and the ruling party won a resounding victory, I was amongst the crowd at their victory rally, which I believe was held, it was somewhere down in St. John's. And half the crowd couldn't vote. 50% of the individuals in attendance at that rally were not old enough to vote. And that is something that goes to show you the level of strategy,
the perception
that the party puts in, not just that party, but all parties, the level of strategy that politically goes into an election. The reason that 50% of the crowd was turned out in, of course, their party paraphernalia, but as I say, frankly, it looked to me like they couldn't vote. The reason for that was because the party has, of course, encouraged them to come out. They're probably members of the party's youth movement or youth section, but the party knows that in the next 4 years, they will be able to vote. Yeah.
So they're thinking ahead.
Yeah. Yes, that was an interesting experience for me. And you see that parties that do that tend to succeed better than the parties who are sitting on their laurels.
Well, you see this even in international politics, because I remember during the Trump election, one of the things that he was complaining about while campaigning was the fact that the CNN and I guess NBC camera crews would never turn around and show how big his crowd was, because that kind of perception and image creation has a lot to do with how the viewing audience is going to perceive your likelihood of success. Yeah. And when people think, okay, this person's more likely to win, that's going to affect whether they go out and vote. A lot of people, if they think the person that they are opposing will win, they will not bother to go vote, because it's like, well, he's won already.
Yeah, that's true.
So, yeah.
But for instance, I'll tell you, in terms of reading or perceiving success based off of the image of participation, that can be misleading at times, because, for instance, in the last election, I'll tell you, there was a particular party that held a massive rally. It was a really well-attended rally. And that sort of gave the perception at that point that that party might have done a little better electorally than they in fact did.
Yes.
And they in fact did not do very well. And so it was like, I mean, nobody was expecting them to have made this particular party I'm discussing, to have made any major inroads. But just from the amount of participation, which you saw at that and maybe another event, there was this perception that this group, they may do better than we think.
Yeah.
But they didn't. Of course, I suppose your political system comes into play, because if you're spreading votes across constituencies, you could have a crowd that's 50,000 people strong, but if amongst those 50,000, it's just one person too short in each of the constituencies, when you spread it out, you will lose all of them.
Right. Yep. The crowd is not always an indication of how much support you actually have. But we all know Antigua people love a session. So. Yes.
In Antigua and Barbuda, you presently, I can only talk presently. I mean, others could talk historically about what would have been. I'll talk about what there is now. You don't have independent news media in Antigua and Barbuda. It's a tragedy, but you really don't have it. Observer does what it can in that regard. And Observer is and has been for a long time the face of what we would call independent, non-aligned news media. In Antigua and Barbuda, there is not a well-stocked fraternity of independent news media houses. What you have is, at present, I can talk for the present, you have Observer, and then you have a number of politically controlled stations and outlets. Our present leader of government has his own radio station. And what I have discovered is that it becomes very difficult to expect the general public to have an understanding of what's going on and to be accurately informed about what's going on if they are constantly bombarded by lies. and exaggerations and propaganda, which is essentially the job of political media.
I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me today. It was very edifying, and I look forward to seeing what you do in the future.
All right, Thanks so much. Have a good day.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Grassroots Radio. If you enjoyed the conversation, show some love and help spread the word. You can do that by subscribing on Apple, Google, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Already subscribed? Consider leaving a 5-star review. It helps other people find the show. If you have an idea for someone you want to see featured or a topic you want us to cover, let us know. DM us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at grassrootsanu, or email us at thenewgrassroots@gmail.com. For more about NGR, visit us at thenewgrassroots.com. Until next time, this is Grassroots Radio.